This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Noelle Weir and Steenz. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and on this episode, I talk with Noelle Weir and Steenz, the creative duo behind the new book from Oni Press, Archival Quality. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off at the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And for the month of March, you can find a variety of bundles that will make your shopping experience even more pleasurable for your wallet. Right now, you can find a Marvel Legacy bundle and a Marvel Fresh Start bundle at 50% off of what you'd pay for the comic books individually. There's a Valiant bundle at 50% off, and there are several DC bundles you can also get for 50% off, including bundles for their Vertigo, Young Animal, and DC Kids lines. Check out the great prices at dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. Today I have the pleasure of talking with Noelle Weir and Christina Steward, better known to the comics community as Steenz. They have a new book coming out this week from Oni Press, Archival Quality. It's the story of a young woman who gets a job as a museum archivist, but who soon discovers that her new place of employment is haunted. As she investigates the mystery behind the spectral activity, she also confronts her struggles with mental health and the relationships that have sustained her in the past. Over the course of our conversation, I talk with Ivy and Steenz about the genesis of this narrative, their methods of collaboration, and the story's thematic observations and keen cultural awareness. I found this an insightful interview, and I'd like to share that with you now. I have the pleasure of having on the Comics Alternative podcast Noelle Weir and Christina Steward, otherwise known as Steenz. They are the creative team behind Archival Quality that comes out very, very soon. In fact, this week when this episode goes up. So Ivy, Steenz, welcome to the Comics Alternative.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And let's begin by me asking you, what is Archival Quality?
Ivy, do you want to start?
Sure. So Archival Quality is a original graphic novel that Steenz and I have been working on now since 2015.
Yes.
Yes, quite a while. And it follows the story of Celeste, also known as Cell Walden, who is a young woman who ends up losing her job after having trouble maintaining her issues with anxiety and depression. She finds a new job at a medical oddities museum, and the job is a little strange. She has to live at the museum, and she has to work overnight, and she soon learns that there is more going on in the museum than she knows, including a ghost that is haunting its walls and beginning to appear to her and ask her for help.
So would you call this a ghost story, but in, let's say, the non-traditional way that most people understand ghost stories?
I mean, yeah. So I am like, really, I have like a lifelong fascination with ghost stories and haunted house stories. And so I think that there's so much more than two ghost stories than just, somebody in like a white sheet, like rattling chains. Like, I think that, yeah, the most effective, ghost stories and haunted house stories are actually more about things that are forgotten or things that want to be remembered, or this sort of complex emotion of not being able to let go or move on from things. And so that's really what I was trying to accomplish with writing this as a ghost story.
Yeah, and one of the things that really struck me about this story is the fact that you're dealing with some very weighty issues. And so, you're using, let's say, loosely speaking, the structure of a ghost story in order to tell a narrative that raises a lot of important issues. And you mentioned some of those. For instance, the issue of psychological wellness, of being an outsider, of not being understood. And you're also able to bring in, for both of you, your experiences as librarians. Is that correct?
Yes. Both librarians for a brief point in time. But yeah.
So, yeah, well, tell me how your librarian experiences have kind of seeped into archival quality.
Well, for me, as the artist, I find that a lot of what I gained from just being in the stacks helped a lot when it came to the aesthetic and the feel of archival quality. Many libraries have, back rooms or stacks filled with books and dust and who knows what. And the one that I worked at in St. Louis Public Library, it was huge. It was enormous. I mean, that's where I would go to like get away, And I kind of use that as my inspiration for where Cell works for most of her time during the book. I wanted it to feel like it wasn't very new, but also could be new. Like the room that she works in is very old, and the computer that she uses is very old, but the stacks itself is like expansive, and it looks like it took some time to actually put it together, which is what a lot of stacks are. They're old institutions, many libraries are, but they also can hold a lot of secrets. So that's what I was trying to go for.
Yeah, and for me, it's almost the complete opposite, because my librarianship and like what I brought to this was very theoretical. So actually, I have my master's degree in library science, and my undergrad studies were in art history, where I actually ended up doing a lot of research on Foucault and Derrida and archiving and the concept of archiving, particularly in how it relates to images. So when I approached this, I was thinking, like about the ethics of archiving, the ethics of librarianship. When we commit things to an archive, like biological specimens or in this case, skulls, which is slightly unrealistic, but, there's lots of things that we commit into archives and into libraries and into museums that are in this ethical gray area, like who decides what gets put in there, and does what is being archived consent to being archived. And so that's really been the basis for a lot of my studies in librarianship and in archival science. So that was what I really wanted to explore in this story, which I'm thankful I got to do it in more of a fun ghost story way, because all of undergrad was just writing about Foucault.
And, you mentioned some of the ethical implications of archiving without giving anything away, because I don't want to deal in spoilers here. But you do raise many ethical issues when it comes to what's going on at this library.
Yes. So I, during my undergrad degree, I worked as an intern in a medical photography archive. And it was done extremely ethically. They were very ethical. They were very serious about their ethics. And I thankfully don't know of any existing medical museums that don't pursue these things ethically. It's like a very they apply a really stringent code of ethics to the work that they're doing, these museums and these archives. But because it's spookier if it's not ethical. But B, it didn't used to be. There are so many of the items in these collections are sort of passed down, and they're old, and they have this very questionable ethical history where you start to ask, well, is there a historical value in this that outweighs the fact that it's kind of horrendous how it was come across?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned the spookiness of library work when there's not the attentiveness to ethics. And, there is something quite creepy about this library where Sell gets the job, the Logan Museum. And in fact, one of the earliest characters that we're introduced to, in addition to Celeste, is, and tell me if I'm mispronouncing his name, Abayomi Abiola?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Okay, good. And he's the chief curator. And until we learn more about him later in the narrative, he does come across as a little creepy. And then every time the board comes up in conversation, I mean, even referring to a group of people as the board, I mean, it has this ominous feel to it. And so I think the creepy factor in this story is cranked up just a little more. And we do find out more about what goes on with the board and Abayomi, and then others that with some, it kind of demystifies who they are, but with others, I mean, there's still this kind of creepy factor, specifically with the board.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that comes from like my own background in prior to working in publishing, I worked in nonprofits and in academia, and I think that a board can be very sinister in some ways, but it's more about them being a source of being arbiters of power and decision making, and they're without spoiling the book, they are up to some things where they are abusing that power, and so it became, for me, it's more of a commentary on these arbiters of knowledge, or these people who are running museums. Obviously we made these guys cartoonishly sinister, but I think people should be questioning the ethics of these things. I think that that's an important part of, especially for white Americans, breaking down our notions of colonialism, taking what we've taken and putting it in museums. It should be being questioned. And our board is obviously pretty bad, but people should be having that dialogue with themselves and with the things they're interacting with in museums in a reasonable way all the time.
Right, and unless I'm misremembering, the one board member that we actually see in this story is, or at least he seemed to me, unambiguously white. Other than him, though, you do have a pretty broad and varied population in this story.
Yeah, I know when Ivy came to me with the story, I was very excited just because it's kind of up my alley, ghost stories in general. But she also didn't put any descriptors for what these people look like. She just kind of gave me the general idea of their personalities and their histories, and from there is when I decided what these characters are going to look like. And I made a conscious decision to make it so that most of them are going to be people of color. Celeste is Samoan, and then you've got Abayomi, who is from Africa. We've got Holly, who is Korean and Black American. And I really like the idea that you can have an adventure with characters of color and not have their race be a factor in the storytelling. Not only white people have adventures. And I know when I was younger, that's what I wanted to see. Any kind of story that I got that had a Black character in it, they were kind of just talking about the struggle, or they were dealing with some racist or anything like that. And I didn't want that. And so having the opportunity to create a story where I can put that idea into people's heads and actually encourage people to make more stories with characters of color without having to feel like that they need to explain why they're there, you know?
And that's a good point, because issues of race, ethnicity, and even nationality really don't play any part in archival quality. And in fact, I think if people didn't know that Celeste was Samoan, that Abayomi was African, that Holly was, let's say, a Black and then Korean background, you really wouldn't know it. Maybe other than Abayomi's name, people may think, okay,
Sure.
there seems to be something there that sounds African. Other than that, though, there are really no indicators. I mean, other than the coloring, so we do see that these are characters of some color, but the color, the ethnic background really plays no part of what's going on with the action.
Yeah, and not saying that, that's what life is like. Of course you're going to run into like microaggressions, but I feel like in some stories you don't really need all that. We get enough of it in real life that sometimes we actually would like that escape,
That's a good point, because what that does then is it normalizes other experience, let's say other with a capital O, to where you don't even think about their race or ethnicity or nationality as being part of the narrative. It's, something that could happen to almost anyone.
Exactly.
In other words, the cultural ethnic background is not forefronted for any reason.
Right, but it's still a part of them,
Right.
It's not something like, we don't see color. It's more of a thing as it's a part of who we are, but this story is not what it's about,
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's no erasure in any way, but at the same time, their ethnic background does not become a key factor. It reminds me in many ways of what the Hernandez brothers do with their narratives, right? Because we know that Maggie and Hopi and that the characters of Palomar all come from a Latino background in one form or another, but it's a rarity that the Latino-ness of these characters become a part of the story. Every now and again it happens, but other than that, if you didn't know that these characters were Latino, you really wouldn't think that they're Latino or any kind of a nationality or from an ethnic background.
Right, and you want to make sure that it's like, not that you don't know what they are, but like, it serves no purpose in this specific situation.
Right, exactly.
So it's like, that it's Black, but it doesn't really matter. There's a ghost hanging around. We should probably solve that before stereotype some people,
Exactly. So let's back up a bit and talk about the genesis of archival quality. I mean, you've been working on this for about 3 years now, you say?
Yeah.
It's about to see publication. So where did this idea come from?
So when I was interning in the medical photography archive, when I was about 22, I was still an undergrad and I was writing so much about the ethics of medical photography for my art history degree. And I was starting to get I don't know, kind of like what Sontag might call compassion fatigue. I was getting really burnt out, and I was starting to become very desensitized to what I was seeing all the time. And so I started writing a short story, which turned into a novella about a girl who works in a medical photography archive and ends up finding this story of this ghost through the photographs that she's cataloging. And I submitted it to the Clarion Writers Workshop, and I got rejected, and it was the year that Neil Gaiman was teaching, and I'll never forgive him. But basically, I wrote it, I submitted it, and I was 22 years old, and the rejection, I was just this sucks. I'm never going to write anything ever again. I quit. I'm going back to my medical photography thing. So then a couple years later, I saw Steenz' artwork in the Valkyries. Steenz and I both helped to run and still help to run in some ways the Valkyries, which is a worldwide organization for women who work in comic book shops, because we were both working in comic shops at the time. Mm-hmm. And I saw Steenz' art, and I just instantly was drawn to it. It was so colorful, and I had never seen anything like it before. And in some ways it did remind me of that Alterna comics thing, like, you know, you mentioned the Brothers Hernandez, you know, that kind of thing. I was like, this is so unique and like so just not what I'm seeing in mainstream comics. And so we were talking, you know, we had become kind of internet friends, and I was like, hey, I have this idea for this haunted house story. Do you want to draw it? And she said that she was into it, thankfully. And like, we talked back and forth, and then we were going to do it as a web comic, and actually got so far as to buy a domain and like lay out everything. And then Oni opened up their open submissions period in 2015. So we were like, well, it can't hurt to submit it.
And it was interesting because when she asked me about it, I was kind of in a place where I was doing a lot of like personal, like mini comics, and they're all just, you know, slice of life stuff about myself. And I wanted to do something fiction, but I think I'm a terrible writer because I don't practice. And I was looking for something, and I didn't really know what it was. And so when Ivy came to me with that, I was like, oh my God, this is it. I need to take this immediately. So, but yeah, when we did the open submissions, we were like, well, if we don't get picked, we're going to put it out as a webcomic anyway. So there's really no reason why we shouldn't do it. And then we got picked, and 3 years later, here we are.
Huh. You know, that's interesting that you had thought about releasing this first as a webcomic. Did Oni have a policy that if they accepted your project that you couldn't serialize any of it on the web?
I believe so, because I'm pretty sure, because we had intended on posting the first few pages, and we had asked them, you know, like, can we post any of this? And I'm pretty sure they were like, no, we should save it for the book, which was fine with me, because, I mean, it's a book. I'm down with that.
Huh. So, I mean, do you regret not having done this as a webcomic? Because I know that both of you have published material online before.
Yeah, I definitely do not regret it, because I have learned so much from doing this that I would not have learned anywhere else. I believe that if you truly want to become better at drawing, it is to do a comic. The kind of poses and the kind of thinking that you have to use is not something that you get from, you know, one-page illustrations or working at a pace that is kind of slower. Mm-hmm. So I feel like I got a lot out of it because it was so much so quickly, but also it made me think about comics in print in a different way. And I learned a lot from it. And I would have gotten that from, you know, putting it as a webcomic, but this way, you know, we had an editor, so we can talk back and forth. We could talk about different styles. So I think the collaborative effort with both Ivy and an editor also was helpful.
Yeah, and I have to agree. I was pretty much purely a prose writer. I'd only ever written prose. And I don't know that without the guidance of our editor, Robin Herrera, who I owe like a life debt, that I would have gotten to a point where I was making scripts that were as good as what I feel our final product was, just because, you know, she was a resource for me. And I mean, I was learning how to make comic book scripts from looking up like Jim Zub and Fred Van Lente's free templates that they put on the internet, which I'm eternally grateful for. Thank you both. But it was really helpful to have the resources at Oni to make the book, I think, the story the best it could be, you know, to make it a tight story, to make it a solid story, as opposed to just sort of having it meander on as a webcomic.
And, you know, that's not to say that, you know, webcomics are any lesser than, you know, publishing full-size graphic novels. I think it's just a different type of storytelling. You know, when you're doing a webcomic and you post 1 or 2 pages a week, each page has to have something to it, you know. Each page has to grab the reader so that they come back next week. Meanwhile, with a graphic novel, you don't have to worry about that sort of thing, you know. So I also think that if you do webcomics, you have a better understanding of single-page storytelling.
Yeah. I think that if I had been a more confident and experienced writer of comics when we started this, we could have made a good webcomic. But I think that just where I was at with learning about writing comics as opposed to writing prose, I think this just worked better for us for this project.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there are some like amazing narratives that go on for years in webcomics, and I read them and I'm just like, how are you doing this? This is so incredibly impressive to me as a writer.
You know, one of you used the word earlier, meandering, in terms of webcomics. And granted, you know, not all webcomics tend to meander, but there are some that do. We have, and we've been doing this for, I guess, about 3 years now, a monthly series on the Comics Alternative devoted specifically to webcomics. And one of the things that we've noticed with some of the titles is, and I'm not talking about the webcomics that are serialized in a way where it's almost like a newspaper strip where there is a one and done page or strip for every installment. Something almost like a gag strip. I mean, those are a different beast altogether, but kind of longer form narratives. Sometimes there are those webcomics that go in a certain trajectory at first, and then for any number of reasons decides to go in another direction and then take another narrative trajectory and then take yet another on down the line. In other words, what the creator is doing is they're tacking according to where they are in the process of the storytelling. And so with a webcomic, you can see this change in real time, and it is marked historically, right? So people can always go back to an archive if it's available, and it almost always is. And so you can see how the story has changed, which is very different from like what you guys have done, holding on to your comic until it's done, and you can go back through and either yourselves or through the help of an editor decide what worked, what didn't, what needs to be changed, what you didn't intend to have change in the narrative but actually did radically change at some point in the storytelling. And when you make changes on the fly with the webcomic, then that's a part of recorded history.
It is. And what's interesting about that is that sometimes when you do a webcomic, you may or may not have an editor. And so there may be pages or storylines in there that you may want to completely get rid of halfway down the line. You know, it's like you're growing as a creator, and webcomics are kind of that peek into the growth of yourself. So not only is it a comic beginning, middle, and end, but it's also like a journey, if you will. So I don't know. There's something wonderful about webcomics in that you can really see your growth, but also there's a downside as well, which is you can see that hard change. I know when we were doing the book, I started doing the pencils back in 2015 and then inks in 2016. This is an approximation. This isn't exact, and then colors in, 2017. But what was interesting was my art, at least I could tell, was getting better by the end of the book, so much so that I decided that when I was going back through inks, I would ink backwards and correct as I went, because I didn't want it to look like she's growing over these 3 years of creating this book. I wanted it to look consistent. So I had to go back and fix things. And then when I did colors, I went back from the beginning back to the front. And so it was kind of a backwards piece. And when I finally got the book to hold in my hand, it was actually one of the first times I read the book from beginning to end, because I had it going forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards, trying to even out and make sure that things look consistent. And you can't exactly do that with webcomics. I know as a publisher, when we look at webcomics to potentially publish at Lionforge, one of the problems that we keep running into is asking if artists were willing to go back and fix their earlier pages, because oftentimes those earlier pages are just far different in style than later on. And when you're trying to sell a product as a whole, it has to be consistent from beginning to end.
Oh, exactly. And I think that's one of the things you mentioned. Most web comic creators don't have editors. I don't know, and I guess there are those out there. I don't know of any webcomic creator who works with an editor. And in fact, there's some comics creators who work exclusively in print who don't use editors at all. And I think that's a shame.
I think it's also a thing of what they're called. A lot of webcomic writers and fan fiction writers have beta readers, which are editors. Mm-hmm. So if you ask people if they have a beta reader, they're like, oh, yeah, of course. Everyone has someone that looks over their work for them. But to say that they do or don't have an editor kind of makes it feel like it's a little different. But I think most webcomic creators do have some kind of second pair of eyes to look at things. I just think that in webcomics, they call them beta readers instead of editors.
Yeah. And, along with that, there are the actual readers themselves who provide commentary if a webcomic creator allows that. And I've seen several webcomics that actually change over time because of reader reaction. And, I mean, there's some potentially positive things from that. On the other hand, there's a downside to relying on reader reaction as well in terms of where to go, where to tack in the narrative.
Right.
Yeah. Now, Ivy, you were saying a moment ago that most of your background is in prose writing. And I'm curious how you found, regarding archival quality, this transition from writing through exclusively words to thinking about how images are going to contribute to your text.
So I think, Steenz, as she just detailed in talking about writing or drawing this book backwards and forwards, at least 3.5 times. I think that some scenes were more than that in the end. She worked along with me really well. I was really happy that Steenz and I had such a good working relationship with this, because I tend to think I went to school for studio photography. I ended up switching to an art history program. So I had some background in movie making and film. And I'm kind of a film nerd. And so a lot of how I wrote comic scripts is more like how you would see a film script and less like how you would see a comic script. And so there was kind of sparse direction for scenes, kind of sparse direction from me in a lot of the scenes. They were more dialogue driven. And then Steenz and I would talk. And during the process of this, we would talk every day and go back and forth. And so if there was something that I had put in the script that Steenz didn't understand what I was trying to say, I would talk her through it. Or if she showed me something and I was like, oh, I think in my head it looks more like this, we would talk through it. So I think I was lucky that when I came into writing comics from writing prose, that Steenz and I had such a collaborative and communicative relationship. And that really helped me see things more visually, because literally sometimes she would sketch things out for me, thumbnail things. On another comic that we were working on, we were sending each other reference photos of ourselves. She has a picture of me holding a giant stuffed animal, pretending it's a dragon egg. We have a good collaborative relationship, which helps. And I think that, this for me is baby's first graphic novel. So I think moving forward, I have a better concept of how they work, but it was difficult initially to know panel structure, how many panels is too many panels.
Yeah. And that's something that you really don't know until you've done it. You can read as many comics as you like, but until you start studying the actual art of comic making, there's no way you know.
Now, you were saying that at times you were communicating every day about the script and the visuals. How would you get in touch with one another? Would you talk on the phone? Would you use Skype? All of the above?
I'm terrible at talking on the phone. I never really hear Ivy's voice unless we're doing a podcast or here at a convention. Mostly through Facebook Messenger. We literally talk every single day, and I feel like we've talked every single day since 2015. And I think that's also just a because we're best friends kind of thing, not so much because we're collaborating on a project. But also it was interesting because when we started this project, Ivy was in the midst of getting her master's. And so she would wake up at like 5 o'clock in the morning and work on stuff. And I wouldn't get to actually look at it until the evening when I got home because I worked late. So I'd be working late into the evening, working on pages. And then she'd wake up in the morning and see those pages in the morning. And so we kind of would talk about things as they were going, but not as I was drawing because she was asleep when I'm drawing, you know? And then to have Robin, our editor, in there 2 hours behind us was another wrench into that. So it was very different and kind of a difficult way of working, but I feel like that was the hardest way it could be. So there's nothing I can't handle now.
Yes. Oh man. And whatever we do next, I won't be in grad school for, so it'll automatically be better.
Yeah. Cause there are definitely plenty of nights where I'm just like, I don't know what to do with this page. Ivy's asleep. Robin won't know. I guess I'm done drawing for the evening, or I'll just move on to another page. And, you know, that was probably the most frustrating part of the whole process. But like, also I learned a lot from it because there will be times when I'm just like, okay, maybe I just can't wait for Ivy. Maybe I just need to make a decision myself and just try it out, see how it works. And so it gave me a little more confidence as well to make decisions on the book, which made it feel more like a co-creator kind of situation, like we both collectively created this book together rather than it was Ivy's story and my art. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So it does have from each of your perspectives that feel to it, right? It's not like, you know, one did the writing and the other did the art, but each collaborated on both. I mean, obviously, you know, Ivy, you know, carried the weight primarily in terms of the writing, and then Steenz with the art, but Ivy's input on the art affected what it ultimately looked like, and then Steenz's input into the story beats fed into the actual writing of the story.
Yeah, and I mean, there were times when Steenz would be like, I don't think this works visually. I'm going to try it this way. Tell me what you think. And I'd be like, oh yeah, that works better. Or, you know, times when we would disagree on how things should be handled. When Robin would come in and be like, I think that it should go this way. So, you know, it definitely was a team effort. And I don't think the story would have been as strong if we hadn't been able to work together on it and work through some of these things collaboratively. I think that me just dictating a story to Steenz wouldn't have made a book that feels so authentic and alive to me.
Yeah, I would agree.
Is there anything about Archival Quality that, how do I put this, kind of changed radically as you guys started to do more and more collaborative work together? In other words, is there something in the initial layout of the story that you changed that if we knew about it, we'd think, wow, that's a significant change from the story we actually have?
Certain characters' roles became more pronounced. For me, like when I originally wrote the story as like a prose story, it was pretty much 100% about Celeste. And the other characters were not as important. And so when we initially started working on it, I felt like that was still where my focus was. But as time went on, and also as I saw Steenz's designs for the characters and how much personality she gave them and how they looked, other characters started to become more important. Gina, Holly's girlfriend, she certainly took a bigger role. And that was actually partly our editor being like, you got to give her something to do. She can't just be there. So, you know, there were some, it mostly did have to do with how characters developed and changed and became more important. It became more of an ensemble book, which I'm happy about.
Yeah. I mean, it's nice to see, you know, Sel figuring things out on her own, but I think it's better for the story for her to have people around her, because I feel like those who are going to be reading this book and have issues with, you know, anxiety or depression are going to realize that they're not alone in all of it, there are other people around who are A, willing to help you, and B, are affected by the way you handle things as well. So it's nice to see her interact with more of the characters.
You know, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think that's one of the changes that I really noticed in terms of Celeste. When we're first introduced to her, we do learn some of her background, and, you know, that she had problems with depression and anxiety. And then because of her experiences and feeling so vulnerable during that time, the time before the events of Archival Quality begin, then she is almost takes a stand in the extreme opposite end, right? She says, I will do things on my own. I am not going to be a victim. I am not going to be someone that people take care of. I can take care of myself. And in fact, she gets angry at times when others, like her boyfriend Kyle, or people like Holly or Abiomi, attempt to help her in any way. And it's only as things develop that she starts to understand, maybe, there is something that people can help me with, and I can't just do it all on my own.
Yeah, I think that is so. I'm fairly candid in talking about how my own experiences with anxiety and depression kind of influenced this book. It's something that I've dealt with for my entire life. And there were definitely times in my life when I felt that I was more like Sel, where I was like, I don't want help. I don't need help. I'm not a victim. I think that making yourself vulnerable and open to help is really scary when you're in that position, because it's admitting that something is wrong. Admitting that you need help is the first part of admitting that things aren't going well. Where you might think that you're able to just sort of shove it down and carry on and, keep a stiff upper lip or whatever. And admitting that you need help kind of breaks that facade, and opens you up in a way that's uncomfortable, especially if you're not really open about being candid with your emotions, or unwilling to make yourself vulnerable in that way, usually. And so it was really important to me in this story and I know that mental health, people's struggles with mental health, they look different on everybody. Depression is different on everyone. And so I wanted her experience to feel true and to feel authentic. And that means sometimes that you act like a jerk to the people around you, or you're unwilling to accept their help. And what was important to me is, in the end, not showing her being completely fixed, or cured, or, having some huge emotional breakthrough, but instead making actionable change, taking on personal responsibility, admitting that she can use the help of the people around her, that she can make herself open to being cared for, and that she can seek help for herself. At the end of the book, she does say that she's started to see a counselor. And I mean, that can even be the hardest first step, is just getting in the door with a counselor.
Mm-hmm. Now, you guys were earlier talking about your process of collaboration and how successful that seemed. Are you currently working on another project together?
Currently, we have something coming up with what is the name of the anthology that we're doing with Megan?
Divide and Conquer?
Divide and Conquer, yes. It's about women finding fangirl spaces and being a part of a group of fans together. And then, of course, we want to do another, graphic novel, but that is so far not really on the plate at the moment, since we're doing our press run for We've been talking, and I'll text Steenz or Facebook Messenger in the middle of the day and be like, idea, and then I'll be like, we'll talk about this over Skype soon, and then we'll both be like, busy. Yeah. So eventually it'll come back to it, but as of right now, it's just trying to get through the signings, the interviews, the press, so on and so forth.
Well, tell me some of the stuff that you are doing for publicity surrounding Archival Quality.
Sure. So I believe in 2 days. Oh my goodness.
I leave tomorrow.
Gracious. We're going to be in Seattle for Emerald City Comic Con at Phoenix Comics and Games in Seattle on Wednesday night at 5 p.m. We're going to be signing Archival Quality at that comic shop. Then we're going to be at the convention doing several panels. You can go to our Twitter and see we both have our schedules up as our pinned tweets. So we're doing several panels and signings at the Oni booth. We're going to be doing the Emerald City live stage on Thursday as well. Doing a couple of interviews, one with a puppet. That's going to be really fun.
An interview with a puppet?
I'm so excited.
Yeah. That's going to be very interesting. We'll put it on our social media when it's done. And then when we get back from Seattle, I have a few signings at some local comic shops here in St. Louis. So most of the fantasy book ink shops. So Star Clipper, Fantasy Books and Games, Heroic Adventures. I'll be doing those. And I think that's it for me. We might be doing some more at my local library and smaller bookstores, but those haven't been organized just yet.
Yeah, similarly, there are some things in the works for where I'm at in Philly, but nothing set in stone at this exact moment.
Well, what about other projects that you guys are working on currently or have plans for? Maybe not together collaboratively, but individually.
I actually just did some pinup artwork for a Kickstarter for a fairy expansion for the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. So that's pretty fun. It's a very interesting book. It's going to be kind of like heavily neon colors and hard rock, like black elves, and it's interesting. It's Dungeons and Dragons. That's what that is. And I've also been doing a lot of class visits here in St. Louis. I go to a couple of schools and I talk to them about my career and how I got here and what it's like working collaboratively and what it's like to put together a comic. And lately I've been doing courses for the VLAA, which is the Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts. And basically they're a program where you can go online and request some assistance if you need help with looking over a contract or with your taxes or with copyright. And it's all completely free. So I'll go to a class and I'll teach the class a little bit about what copyright is, what kind of taxes you'll need to file as a freelancer, most of the nitty-gritty stuff that you don't really get taught in art school, and then also a little bit about myself. So that's what I do. A lot of class talks.
Yeah, Steenz makes me look like a real slacker. I'm, right now, I just finished grad school.
Congratulations.
And thank you. It was a long stretch writing a book while doing it. And we just wrapped up Archival Quality, so I'm actually at kind of a strange point where I don't have a lot of commitments right now, and I should be writing.
Now, if our listeners want to find you guys online, where would you direct them? I know that Ivy, you have a website. Do you prefer to refer people to your website or maybe a social media account?
Yeah, I'm at ivynoelleweir.com, and you can get in touch with me through there, and it has links to appearances, and you can actually see some comics that Steenz and I made together on there that used to live on our Patreon and now live on there. And I'm pretty much at Ivy Noelle, IvyNoelle, on everything, because I have a weird name, so I could get my screen name to be my name on everything.
And then I'm on Twitter as Steenz. That's OHEYSTEENZ. I'm also on Facebook. You can see my art page, Art of Steenz, on Facebook. And then my portfolio is in the About section on my Twitter page. And there you can see current illustrations and mini comics that I've done, some of them that I did with Ivy. And best way to contact me is through Twitter. I'm always on there.
Okay. And the pub date for Archival Quality, it will be in bookshops on the 6th of March and then in comic shops that following day?
That's right.
Yep.
Well, Ivy, Steenz, I want to thank the both of you for being on the Comics Alternative and talking with me about your new book from Oni Press, Archival Quality. Good luck with all the publicity, with the travels, and I look forward to meeting you guys at a future con.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Much thanks again to Ivy and Steenz for taking the time to talk with me about their new book, Archival Quality, coming out this week from Oni Press. And if you want to find great books like this at impressive discounts, then you should head on over to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com right now and check out the wide range of specials on both single issues and bundled collections of your favorite comics titles. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought of my conversation with Ivy and Steenz. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're two guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to the website comicsalternative.com. We'll be back soon with more interviews and reviews. Until then, take care.